Yeah, I don't think so, unfortunately.
Dude, you literally always get when people walk in the door.
Yeah.
You're chilling.
I'm like gonna try to like base my finances like doing dentist ones.
I would have like kept doing
Lots
it,
of
but
wiggle room.
For some reason, I thought it was like one and done, and then you guys were just like doing it for fun. But
No, there's like a limit per exam. You can only do like 3 or 4 per exam, I forget.
but that's like still a good amount.
Yeah, it's a few points, like it's nothing to sneeze at.
Do they like accumulate, like if you don't meet them for a test?
That just goes above 100.
I showed something.
So if you get like a 98 and you get 3 bonus points, you just get the 101. And then,
We should add, so I showed somebody.
What?
Should I add that?
I thought you only had 3 for the last one. Well, we'll figure that out afterwards.
Okay. Well, there's like no one there.
Oh, really? Did I do none on anyone's?
I don't know if everybody's got-
Might have forgot. All right, just come and talk to me afterwards. I'll make sure you get the right amount.
Okay.
Okay, so we're going to begin this chapter with GDP. So we're going to measure the total production and income in a country. So basically what we'll start with is what gross domestic product is, how we calculate it, who calculates it, all that jazz. Then we'll look at whether GDP actually does what we want it to do. Is it accurate, or is it complete BS, or is it somewhere in between? Then we'll compare real and nominal GDP, and end with looking at a few other measures of total production and total income. So, microeconomics, this is a study of households and firms, how they make choices, how people act and interact. We look at different people's preferences, and how firms are able to like meet people's preferences, how people like agree to do things. So like game theory comes in a lot for how firms compete against each other and how people interact with each other. Macroeconomics, on the other hand, is different, and that's what this class is focusing on, even though the beginning of 101 and 102 are basically the same, going over like all the building up supply and demand, the models from the bottom up. Now we're moving into macro. So we study the economy as a whole. So we're looking at inflation, unemployment, economic growth. So this is looking at like whole countries instead of particular industries or particular products. So the next 3 chapters we're going to do, or I guess next 2 chapters, the 3 topics, are going to be GDP first, so total output. Then we'll look at unemployment and inflation. And these are macroeconomic indicators. They're like, I don't know, looking at it from above instead of looking at like the nitty gritty. They may not be useful for like individual firms trying to figure out what to do, but for macroeconomists trying to understand the general direction of the economy, whether it's healthy or unhealthy, so to speak, it can be very useful. So we'll start off with a few terms that we're going to be talking about. So the first is the business cycle. In the business cycles, there's going to be alternating periods of expansion and recession. So over time, you'll have the economy doing well for a while. You'll have output expanding, people getting jobs, things like that. Eventually, you'll hit a peak and you'll see a decline. You'll see less output being produced. You'll see fewer people being employed, things like that. So alternating healthy and unhealthy, if you want to think about it that way. So the expansion is a period of the business cycle when total production is increasing and total employment are increasing. So things are getting better during the expansion. Current businesses are expanding, new businesses are being formed. There's very few people that want to have a job that can't find a job. Well, it doesn't last forever, and eventually the economy falls into what we call a recession. So it's a period of the business cycle where there's less total production, that goes down, employment goes down, it's harder for people to find jobs. Businesses are producing less, some are going out of business completely or going bankrupt. When we talk about economic growth, we're talking about the ability of an economy to produce increasing quantities of goods and services. And why this is important is that economic growth is, if it's not, it doesn't cause happiness, but economic growth gives people a higher material well-being. So they're able to afford more things. First, like in early stages of economic growth, things that help them survive. And then over time, things that make their life easier or more enjoyable. In general, we're going to measure economic growth with GDP. But it's more than just the total number of goods or total value of goods that are being produced. It's how much they meet consumer values, how much people are being made better off. Because that's really why we engage in economic transactions and trades, is to try to make ourselves better off and to try to meet our needs. And finally, the inflation rate. This changes in the price level from one year to the next. And why that's important is because for consumers, you have $1 this year, that's going to buy a certain amount of goods. If there's inflation, next year it'll buy less or fewer goods. So it has to do with your purchasing power. So if there's high inflation over time and your salary stays the same, you're going to be able to buy fewer and fewer goods, which is going to make you worse off. So through this chapter and through the next chapters, we're going to explore the aspects of the economy, looking at these macroeconomic indicators and how they relate to one another. So we're going to start out by just trying to figure out how to measure the total output in the economy. So total output in the economy is considered, it was one of the first macro statistics we were able to develop, and it's the most widely reported macro statistic and the one that's looked at the most. It's going to be able to tell us how economic activity, how output has been performing in the past, how it is currently, and we can use it to project the future so we can understand if things are looking better or if things are looking worse. Like I said, GDP is the most common measure, and what GDP means is the market value of all final goods and services produced in a country during a period of time. Typically, we measure it in 1 year, and we'll also look at year-over-year changes, the percentage change year-over-year. This definition is important, so you guys should remember this. And we're going to break down the different parts of the definition and what it means on these next slides. So first we talk about the market value. So if you try, when we have the individual markets and we draw a supply and demand graph, we talk about the quantity of goods. That's how we add them up. But when you're looking at, you expand that from just one product or one industry up to the entire economy, it's really difficult conceptually to add together the number of things produced. So cars, melons, haircuts. Shoes, medical care. Very difficult to try to add these together and figure out a way to measure them, like what that all means. Economy produces 14 cars, 100 watermelons, and 72 haircuts. What exactly does that mean? There's no way to translate them. So what we do is we use their market values, what the price these goods and services are sold at on the market to determine their value. Because we use money to pay for all these, it's the one thing that the one unit we can put them all in the same term as, so that it makes some sort of sense. So we take the number of cars sold multiplied by the price of all those cars, and all the melons sold multiplied by the price of that in order to add up for the GDP. Next, final goods and services. So a final good or a service is something that's used by the consumer, by the final user. So we use these to calculate GDP. So these are like the products that you buy from stores that you pick off the shelves. It doesn't count what we call intermediate goods and services. So these are ones that are inputs into another good or service. So if you buy a truck, it's going to come with tires on it. Those tires are likely produced, or they are produced by another company. So these tires are produced by one company and sold to another company, and then used as in the production of a final good or service. So the truck that you purchase is the final good or service. The tire is the intermediate good. And we don't count the tire in GDP because we'll end up double counting it. We'll count it once when it's purchased from the tire manufacturer and goes to the auto manufacturer, and then when the consumer buys it from the auto manufacturer. So we never count intermediate goods in our GDP calculations. So we counted the value of ice cream when it was bought by a store. Say, I don't know if Dale Woods makes ice cream or not. But
Yeah.
they do? Oh, yeah, perfect. So you count the value of Vailwood ice cream when it's purchased by an ice cream place, and then when the customer goes in and purchases it, we'd end up double counting in GDP. So it's like it was being produced twice. So because of that, we only look at the final goods and services. And then we do so during a period of time. Like I said, typically it's 1 year that we look at it. And so that way we don't double count again. So if you buy a DVD in 2011, that counts in 2011 GDP. If we turn around and resell it, we sell it on eBay the next year, it doesn't count again in 2012. So you look at, it counts for GDP the year it's produced and sold. So it's only new goods and services. Stuff that's used has already been produced and counted, so we're not going to count it again. So when we think of GDP, there's two ways that we can measure it. Measure the total economic activity in the economy. We could look at total production, or we could look at total income. When you measure one, you're going to be measuring the other, so they're going to equal each other in the end, but you're looking at it different ways and drawing the numbers from different sources. And the reason this is possible, why you can do it these two ways, is that everything that's being produced and sold is going to be income for someone. So you need to add up all the income we get, or you can add up all the goods that are being produced. So both of these are valid ways, and we can use both of these ways to calculate GDP. Okay, so we mentioned the circular flow diagram early on for like how markets work. We're going to return to that just to kind of illustrate how we can look at GDP and the different how each different market participant affects GDP. So we'll start out looking at just households and firms. So we have households purchase goods and services from firms. And firms, they pay households wages, interest, and profit. So households include the workers and then the investors. Some notes here to make sure I'm telling you everything. Yeah, so firms, what they're going to do is use the factors of production to produce goods and services, and households supply the factors of production in exchange for income. Next, we're going to add in government. So government, how they affect economic activity is they take taxes from households and firms, and it uses those taxes to buy goods and services. So take taxes from households, use it to purchase goods and services from firms. They also make transfer payments, so they'll take taxes from people and then pay them to other people. Transfer payments don't count as part of GDP because nothing's being produced. It's money that's just changing hands. All right, now we'll add in the rest of the world. So this is firms located in other countries. And these are citizens in other countries. So households often buy goods and services from other countries. These are your imports, the goods that are produced in one country and being bought in the United States. And then firms also sell goods and services to people in other countries or firms in other countries. These are known as exports. They're being produced here, going being consumed elsewhere. And finally, there's firms that deal specifically with the flow of money. This is our financial system that we talked about before. So they take savings from households and they loan that money to the government. So the government borrows money from the financial system. And also firms borrow money from the financial system. That's another way that money from households goes into firms. So GDP can be measured as the total wages, interest, rents, and profit received by households. So we could look at the money, all these arrows here that are flowing to households. We can measure GDP as that. Or we can measure GDP as the total expenditures on goods and services done by households, firms, governments, and the rest of the world. So all the arrows pointing here to firms. And if you follow all of the arrows, that's going to be all the different sources of money going to each side. So I guess it's just a way to visualize that the money, whichever side you count on, the household side or the firm side, so household is the income and the firms is the goods being produced and sold. Whichever way, it's going to work out to be the same. So now to measure GDP, how we do this is the Bureau of Economic Analysis, so one of the agencies down in DC. They measure the 4 major categories of expenditures and then add them together. They do this quarterly. So the 4 types of spending that they add is personal consumption expenditures, what we call consumption, the gross private domestic investment, or just investment, government consumption and government gross investment, or government purchases, and net exports of goods or services, NX. So to calculate GDP, we just literally sum those 4 categories. So we can express that as Y, which is typically the abbreviation we use for GDP. Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. Now NX is net exports, so it's going to be the exports minus the imports. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that's the case later when we dig into that one. But we'll look at these each in turn. So first is consumption. This is spending by households on goods and services. This is spending on everything except for purchasing a new house. Housing is going to fall under investment. So we're going to split consumption up, that's what the BEA does, into 3 different categories. And they break it down so we can look at what's going on in these 3 different categories. So the first is services. So things like medical care, education, haircuts, things that are being provided for you by other people. The next is non-durable goods. These are the typical products that we buy and we use up. So these are things like food and clothing, things that are a small portion of our income, and things that, small portion of our income, we don't have to use financing to purchase them. They're cheap enough that we pay them out of our current income. Like I said, they're typically used up fairly quickly. Last category is durable goods. So these are more things like appliances. They're more expensive. They last for a very long period of time. And we typically need to use financing to purchase them. So things like automobiles, they say furniture, but I guess furniture is expensive too. Appliances for the house, things like that. And like I said, non-durable goods are typically used up or they last for a shorter period of time. And then durable goods last for a long time. So like durable goods, typically something like, I don't know, you would have someone come out and repair it in your house if it broke down instead of just like throwing it out and getting a new one. I saw this meme the other day and I thought that was perfect for durable goods. A 99 Toyota Corolla. Talk about durability. Started making a strange sound. I didn't give a shit, ignored it, went away. The end. Actually, this whole ad is pretty funny. But why we care about durable goods is that durable good orders show the confidence that consumers and firms have in an economy, especially not just right now, but over in the future. And that's because they're expensive and they typically require some sort of loan, some sort of borrowing to finance it. So consumers have to be confident not just in their current level of income, but they have to be confident in their employment or like their revenue if they own a business over like the medium and long term, as long as that loan's gonna last. So it's a leading indicator of consumer confidence and business confidence if it's businesses producing or purchasing durable goods. When the Federal Reserve talks about the current state of the economy, they highlight durable goods specifically rather than spending on services or on non-durable goods. I guess I didn't include it there. One of the major components of durable goods is airlines. Just purchasing like a new airplane. In 2014, there was like a major spike randomly where like durable good orders doubled because one of the airlines had to replace like a large number of airplanes like randomly. So you see like this enormous spike literally just from like some planes being ordered. So it's not just consumers that purchase durable goods, it's also firms will purchase durable goods. All right, next is investment. Remember, economists will often have different meanings than the common usage of words. So investment for economists means something different than how we use investment in like everyday conversation. So people say like you're investing in like a stock market or in old coins. This is not how we're talking about investment as it concerns GDP. So investment is things that are going to increase our GDP over time. So spending on new things or things like new factories, new office buildings. It includes addition to inventories that businesses keep on hand, and spending by households and firms on new housing. Yeah. So if you think about it, putting money in a savings account, putting money in a buying old coins, isn't increasing the output in an economy. So it's not being counted in GDP. And the BEA breaks down investments into the following categories. You have business fixed investments, so like new factories, office buildings, machinery, and research and development. They added research and development, I don't remember, at some point in the 90s. Before that, it wasn't being counted as investment. Next is residential investment, so like new family housing and multi-unit housing. And then changes in business inventories, so goods that have been produced but aren't being sold yet.
So what's really the difference between this and like durable goods?
Between investment?
Yeah, but like, no, what's the difference between pretty much like consumption and investment?
So consumption is mostly things that are being consumed like now. And consumption is primarily for individuals. Like I said, this doesn't count intermediate goods. So investment is going to be purchasing things that help you produce more things. So rather than being used for consumption, it's being used for more production, if that makes sense.
So for non-durable goods and durable goods, is there like a fine line between how long it's supposed to last before it's considered a durable good, non-durable good?
As far as I'm aware, no. It's just kind of broken up into like very general, like you use it quickly, small portion of income, and you use it for a long time, large portion. I don't want to say there isn't, but I don't know of any like hard and fast definition. I've never heard anyone talk about that. Next is government purchases. So these are purchases by not just the federal government, but also state and local government on goods and services. So these will be things like teachers' salaries, highways, aircraft carriers. Actual things that the government are spending money on and then getting a good or service back for. Again, this is not going to count transfer payments because those don't result in the production of new goods and services. These are going to result in people having more money, but that's not going to count until it's actually spent by those people. So it does get counted, it just gets counted as part of consumption when it's actually spent. And finally, we have net exports. Exports are the value of exports minus the value of imports. This can be positive or negative. For the United States, for several decades, it's been negative. For some countries, it's positive. For some periods in the US history, it was positive. And the reason we only count exports and we do not count imports, or we remove imports, is because we're trying to look at domestic production. So what's being produced in the United States? So what we do is we add up the value of exports, so all the goods that are sold to foreigners, and we subtract the value that are being goods and services being sold to America by foreigners. So it's not that imports make us poorer, it's because we're looking at spending on US produced stuff. That just by definition, that's what GDP is. We have to add in the exports because they're not being accounted for when we look at the American consumer spending. And then we have to remove imports because that's being counted in that spending when it's not what we're looking at. A lot of people think that exports, because of that, they look at the GDP equation and say, oh, that means imports make us poorer. When that's not really what's going on. Here's a look at GDP. GDP tends to go up over time. So we have the United States from 2000. You see it at like $10 trillion in the year 2000. We're up to about, we were up to about $20 trillion. We see it goes up. There's a slight dip right there in the 2001 recession. Slight dip, a decent sized dip there during the financial crisis, like 2007, 2008. After years of sustained growth, we saw a sharp drop in the, I don't know if there's a name for it yet, the coronavirus recession. Third quarter GDP is expected to recover most of the way back up. Again, this is, GDP is calculated every quarter, so we miss a lot of the, like the daily transactions. Some economists have put together a really cool measure of daily consumer spending. And we see daily consumer spending has recovered to like 96% of the original peak before COVID started. So as of now, we're back close to where we were before this started. And up here we have the year-over-year percent change. So we can track that over time. You can see it falling here, falling there, and falling off the cliff here. So gross domestic product, and this is not adjusting for inflation, this is nominal GDP. It's been running about like 4% since the Great Recession. We have current real GDP. So with real GDP, you take into account the change in the price level. So over time, because there's inflation, the value of each dollar goes down. You need to account for those changes. When we do that, we call it real GDP. And we see the same basic trend. We see real GDP increasing from 2000 up until the beginning of 2020. We see it dropping off a cliff again in 2020. And we see mostly positive, but we see slightly lower because you're pulling out inflation. So growth has averaged about 2.5% since the Great Recession. All right, so here we break down the components of GDP back in 2014. So consumption was the biggest chunk of GDP. The largest portion of our spending is about 2/3. And the majority of that is consumption on services. The US is primarily a service-based economy, and we purchase a lot of services. Next is non-durable goods. So typical consumer spending, things we purchase all the time. Food, clothing, that sort of stuff. And then finally, durable goods is the smallest component of consumption. Next largest portion of GDP is government purchases. This is combined between federal and state and local. Even though we see a lot more federal spending, a lot of federal spending is transfer payments. So it's not actually being counted in GDP. And a lot of actual spending on goods and services are being done by local governments. So we see state and local governments being so much larger than federal, which is kind of surprising at first. Next is investment. It's slightly smaller in government purchases. Again, a lot of it is business fixed investments. So businesses spending money on facilities or on capital. Next is residential investment. So purchasing houses and apartments like that. And finally, change in business inventories is like the smallest portion. Then we have net exports. So we have negative net exports because we import more goods than we export. There's an alternate way we could think of calculating GDP, and we could do that by looking at the value added at each stage of production. So for an example, real quickly, we'll just run through a shirt being sold by LL Bean. So the final selling price of this product has to equal the sum of the values added to the product at each stage in production. So the first stage, you have the cotton farmer. They pick the cotton, as the raw cotton itself is worth $1. So in this case, the value added is $1 at that stage of production. Next, they send it to a textile mill, and they weave it into cotton fabric. At that point, the cotton fabric is worth $3, and it's sold to the shirt company at $3. So the value added is going to be $3 minus the $1 of cotton. So the value added of $2. And the shirt company, they purchased that cotton fabric for $3. They make it into a shirt, and it's now worth $15. So the value added against that difference between the value it is now and what they paid for it, so they've added $12. And finally, LL Bean sells the shirt for $35, so they market for it on their website. So the value added by LL Bean is the $35 they sell it at versus minus the $15 that they paid to purchase it. So they've added $20 of value. And when you sum those four up, we end up with the $35 of value added. This kind of illustrates the values being created as we take these raw materials, turn them into intermediate goods, and then eventually sell them on the market. So next, does GDP actually measure what we want it to? One of the biggest opponents of GDP was Oscar Morgenstern, who was a great economist and mathematician. One of the things that Morgenstern did was during World War II, he was involved in this special, I forget what it was called. It was like a special math group that they got all these math nerds together in Manhattan and like locked them in a room and had them solve all these logistical problems that the army was facing, or that the whole military was facing. And it had some of the smartest people like in the world in there. It was like the Manhattan Project for like the nuclear bomb but it was for like, it was just mathematicians doing logistical problems. So, in honor of him, and so I don't wait till like the very end of class to do this, I have a question for you guys. So you have your airplanes. You're involved in the Air Force in bombing in World War II. Oh, the Air Force was a part of Army then, so they're still the Air Corps. So you don't want them shot down by enemy fighters. So you have all these planes that came back from bombing raids already. So you look at like where they're being shot for where to put the armor. The idea being that there's an optimal amount of armor you can put on planes. You put on too much, they become too heavy. They're not maneuverable. They're easier to shoot down. They're using a lot more fuel. Things like that. So you want to be able to put on the perfect amount of armor. So you only want to put it where it's most necessary. So what they did was they went to this group of mathematicians with some data they thought was super useful. So basically they said, they looked at all the bullet holes on all the planes that came back from their bombing raids. And the officers, what they wanted them to do was look at, tabulate all that and figure out, okay, like where on the plane are the most holes, so where should we put the armor? But the guys working for there, which included Morgenstern, had a completely different answer. They said, you don't look where the bullet holes are, you look where the bullet holes aren't. Guys have any idea why?
Because the planes like made it bad.
Yeah, because they made it back. So, all right, some of these notes here are pretty mathy. So yes, where are the missing holes? I mean, the ones that, I didn't write down. So you've got your airplane. I'm gonna draw a terrible looking airplane from the bottom. And you've got bullet holes peppering the entire thing. Let's say you got the engine here and you got the fuselage back here. So you got a ton of damage on the wings, a lot of damage on the fuselage, a lot of damage on the back, but very little on the engines. So the initial thought was, oh yeah, like there's a lot on the fuselage, let's put it there. There's a lot on the wings, let's put it there. The problem with that is we're not counting the ones that didn't come back. The ones that didn't come back were all being shot up here. And what the people like Morgenstern and something Wold, I forget what Wold's first name was, looked at the planes, thought of the planes that weren't coming back. They gave the example, if you go to a hospital, you'll see a lot more people with bullet wounds in their leg than you will bullet wounds in their head or their heart, because they're much more likely to survive. So same thing with these airplanes. So mathematicians, they always ask what assumption you're making. They try to figure out what the assumptions are and whether these assumptions are likely to hold. So the officers that wanted them initially just to put it on the fuselage, accidentally, they didn't realize it made the assumption that the returning planes were like a random sample. If that was true, then putting them on the fuselage would make sense. But because it wasn't a random sample, hitting in different spots led to different chance of crashing and being shot down. This falls apart. There's a joke about economists because all of our models start off with assumptions and they're pretty unrealistic. You have like a chemist, a physicist, and an economist stuck on a desert island, and they have a can with no can opener. They don't know how to get it open. So the chemist says, I'll put it in this special liquid solution. If we get the right chemicals, we can like melt off the top. The physicist says, no, we need to get like a couple rocks. We can make sort of lever from them and we can like jam it open. The economist is like, you guys are crazy. Just assume a can opener. Great in theory, but it doesn't help you at all in real life. Now we have 5 minutes left in class. I'm not going to jump into whether GDP does a good job measuring or not. So we could talk about next time its shortcomings and measurement errors within it.